Today we have Democratic candidate for the governor of Texas, Beto O'Rourke. Beto, thanks for coming back on.
Brian, thanks for having me.
Americans have been contending with higher prices for months because of this pandemic. This is something that Republicans have hammered Biden over, even though the entire world is dealing with the same issue. And yet, just this week, Greg Abbott decided to create a massive bottleneck on the Texas-Mexico border by mandating inspections by DPS. Produce suppliers have warned that starting this weekend, there's going to be shortages of fruits and vegetables. Furniture, auto parts, food are all going to be delayed. What kind of an impact is this having on Texans? And how does someone justify this kind of political grandstanding when people are already hurting?
This is really hurting Texas and the people who live in this state. You mentioned produce. We import 2/3 of the produce that we buy in our grocery stores from Mexico. And so when Greg Abbott shut down northbound commercial traffic from Mexico at our ports of entry as part of this political stunt, it ended up forcing those importers to rely on sources in other parts of the country if they could find them. But more often than not, they were empty-handed. And so you'll see empty store shelves as soon as this weekend for those key products that we import from Mexico. But in addition to the inconvenience for consumers, you've got those importers and those truck drivers and those logistics companies and customs brokers and warehouse employees and owners struggling right now to make ends meet. In some cases, having to let people go. In other cases, moving businesses from the state of Texas to Nogales, Arizona, which is another port of entry, 1,200 miles away from the Rio Grande Valley. So this is really hurting the people of Texas, but Brian, it's also hurting the people of this country. The overall economic hit to the state of Texas is estimated at about something like $470 million to the negative. To the United States as a whole, it's very close to $1 billion that it knocked the US GDP. So you're right, at a time of already rising inflation, higher prices, and scarcity on our supermarket shelves, we have the governor of the state of Texas electing to do that to us and getting absolutely nothing for us in return, except for those higher prices, greater inflation, and more supply chain problems.
And of course, his 5-minute hit on Fox, which I think is the point of all of this. And speaking of exactly that, a lot of the right gets their news from these information silos. What's to stop Texans who might not be paying attention to the news from just thinking, higher prices, Joe Biden's at it again? Like, could Abbott be just banking on the fact that Biden's going to shoulder most of the blame for this? And so Abbott's just doing what he can to exacerbate an already painful problem.
I'm sure he's hoping that that's going to be the outcome. But part of the reason that I'm talking with you right now, part of the reason I'm headed down to the Bridge of the Americas that connects El Paso with Ciudad Juarez in about 20 minutes to hold a press conference, part of the reason that I've been in Del Rio and Laredo and McAllen and Mercedes and Pharr, Texas over the last few days is to make sure that I help people see exactly why this is happening and the fact that it didn't have to happen. But this is a consequence of having a governor who uses the border as a prop to scare the rest of Texas, or the country for that matter, to score cheap political points against the Biden administration, while hurting the very people that he is supposed to serve and look out for here in the state of Texas. And Brian, this is obviously not the only time that he's caused inflation in Texas. When he shut down our electricity grid last winter, it resulted in much higher utility costs for all ratepayers across the state of Texas. On average, $45 more per month in each household across the state of Texas. In addition, since he's been governor, we've seen property taxes, which in a state that doesn't have an income tax is one of the primary ways we pay taxes into our local and state governments. Property taxes have gone up by tens of billions of dollars. This is the inflation governor, and he's really hurting the people of Texas. And we've got to make sure that every single Texan knows that.
Well, not to be outdone by himself, Greg Abbott also decided recently to send a bus full of migrants to Washington, D.C., delivered right to the building that houses Fox News in case his intentions weren't obvious enough. Is this what Texas Republicans voted for? The theatrics and jockeying for cable news time?
These stunts while yes, they may score some points on Fox News, are deeply damaging to the state, to the competitiveness of Texas businesses. And there are a lot of Republicans, including Republican business owners, as well as Democratic business owners, who get this because they see it and how difficult it is to attract talent and investment to our border communities. When even though they are among the safest places in America, you've got a governor describing them as a war zone. That's really hurting them, and it's hurting all of us by extension. This stunt by sending some migrants who had to voluntarily board those buses to go to Washington, D.C., who, by the way, probably agreed to get on those buses because their final destination was Virginia or Maryland. They got a free ride paid for by the Texas taxpayer. We understand here in Texas that we need solutions on the border. There are legitimate problems around illegal drug trafficking and human smuggling. But if you have a governor who's more focused on the stunts instead of the solutions, you're only going to exacerbate these problems. And what Abbott has done is literally create chaos on the US-Mexico border, whether it's the National Guard deployment, where 4 of those Guard members have taken their lives since Abbott activated them, this latest stoppage at our international ports of entry with commercial truck traffic, or just the rhetoric that has inflamed tensions. And Brian, I would argue, helped to induce someone in 2019 to come to El Paso and murder 23 people, claiming he was here to repel the invasion that Governor Abbott had warned him about. So there's a real cost and consequence to the people of Texas. And it's not just Democrats or independents, it's Republicans as well who get this. And I know that there will be a political cost ultimately for Abbott. He may in the short term enjoy a lift on Fox News. In the long term, and especially in November, voters are going to remember this. And I'm going to do everything I can in my power to remind them each and every day of the cost and consequence of having Greg Abbott in office. It's higher inflation and it's more chaos on the border.
Now, looking forward to the election, nearly 23,000 of the Texans who voted in this month's primaries saw their ballots get rejected by elections officials. That's 13% of the total votes cast in the same state that saw a rejection rate of under 1% during the 2020 election. And of course, black voters were disproportionately impacted. Now, I don't think I need to ask you to explain the abject corruption behind the GOP's decision to pass their voter suppression bill, but I will ask, have the Democrats been able to rectify this issue since the primaries?
I don't know if the Democrats are, and I sure wish the Department of Justice would, but we can't wait on somebody else. And so in our campaign, which is comprised of the people of Texas, we're at the doors right now, Brian, letting voters know what it's going to take to make sure that they follow these new rules of the road, which were set last year in an effort to make it harder for people to vote. So having conversations with people about the kind of voter ID they're going to need to use at the polls, or if they want to vote by mail, the fact that they're going to have to match the ID they use today with the ID that they originally used to register to vote, even if that was 70 years ago, which was the case for a World War II veteran, 95 years old, who defended our democracy and fought fascism half a world away and had his ballot rejected 3 times in our recent primary elections right here in the state of Texas. So we've got to be the answer to this problem. And we are. 60,000 plus volunteers have signed up at betofortexas.com, and we are deploying them at the doors right now, not waiting for the official start of the campaign season or get out the vote in the fall of 2022, doing it right now in April. And we have been at those doors for the last couple of months. So we are the answer, we meaning the people of Texas. And I actually feel very confident in our ability to overcome it. And then once we win this election, set right our election laws so that anyone, Republican or Democrat or independent, is able to freely and fairly choose those people that they want to represent them in free and fair elections.
Now, what's the state of this race so far? I mean, like a snapshot of how it's going right now.
So the latest snapshot that we've received has been a poll conducted by the Texas Lyceum that shows Greg Abbott at 42%, shows me at 40%, and a margin of error of plus or minus 3.2%. So we are looking pretty good right now. When you add to that those 60,000 plus volunteers who've signed up, and as strong a campaign as we ran in 2018, that level of volunteer participation is far and away greater now than it was then. It just shows you the enthusiasm, not necessarily for me, not necessarily for the Democratic Party, but for Texas to get on the right track and fully realize its potential and its promise. Folks recognize that this abortion ban with a $10,000 bounty on the back of anyone who assists any woman in making her own decisions, this fixation the governor has on transgender kids and prosecuting their parents for child abuse, the fact that he's left Child Protective Services absolutely unfunded for the challenges that they have with 30,000 kids in the foster care system, many of them sleeping in CPS offices, 100 of them having lost their lives in the custody and care of the state of Texas just over the last year. The chaos that this guy is producing because of his corruption, his incompetence, and his absolute cruelty against the most vulnerable. The people of Texas are standing up to be counted against this and for something better. So the snapshot right now looks good. We could always use more hope, more help, and we want to make sure that we give the people of Texas the hope that they deserve. So we're encouraging folks to go to betofortexas.com and sign up to be a supporter or a volunteer to help us win this thing.
So I have two last questions about this race specifically. And the first is, Democrats have watched their edge with the Latino population kind of evaporate in recent years, and not just in Texas, but across the country as well. What is your campaign and the Texas Democrats doing to kind of gain back that lost support?
There was a lot written and talked about in terms of the perceived slide in places like South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley in 2020, where Trump performed better than he had in 2016. I think that's the result of two things. One, Republicans who really worked hard to connect with voters there. And I think credit should be given where it is due. And Democrats who took those same voters for granted. So here's what we're doing. We are showing up all of the time in these communities. I literally was just in the Rio Grande Valley and in South Texas and in communities like Laredo. I went to Del Rio, which is one of the hardest places in Texas to get to. You don't arrive there just by chance. It has to be an intentional destination. But I showed up for the people of Del Rio. These are communities that are 90 to 95% Mexican American that historically have had record low levels of voter turnout, in part because of Republican control of voting laws that drew them out of our democracy. But we're bringing people in and we're showing up to listen, to learn, to reflect back what we hear. And yes, we're happy to talk about immigration, but Brian, that's not the leading issue there. It is jobs and jobs and jobs, and the kind of jobs that we all want to be able to work, and then we want our kids to be able to work. Jobs that pay a living wage, that provide that purpose and function that we all want in our lives. Jobs that these communities are going to create if they have a real partner in the governor's office. They're talking about public education, getting the back of our school teachers who are grossly underpaid in the state of Texas and are under constant attack from this governor. And they're talking about things like being able to see a doctor, which most of the rest of the country takes for granted. But in the least insured state, these border communities are the least insured part of our state. And so people are still dying there of diabetes and the flu and curable cancer. So showing up and connecting on the issues that matter most to people, that's how we win these elections. And then last thing, per the conversation we've had already on the border and these stunts that Greg Abbott is pulling, what he's doing right now in slowing down trade traffic with Mexico, it hurts the entire state of Texas, but nowhere more so than in these border communities. It is decimating businesses there. It is cutting off the economic lifeline of places like Laredo and McAllen and Pharr and El Paso. And we're going to make sure that every single voter in these communities knows that. And it's why it's so important that we have these volunteers and these donors who can make sure that we have the resources and the people to reach the voters who can decide the outcome of this election.
And secondly, kind of the other side of that coin, we'll finish with this. What do you say to people who voted Republican all their lives to get them to give you a chance?
We say, you are welcome to join us, and we want you to be part of this. We judge no one. We do not care. I say, no me importa who you voted for in the last election. The letter next to your name. Before we're anything else, we are Texans, and we're going to do what is best and right for Texas. And when many of these Republican voters have a chance to join us in these conversations and see this focus on jobs and world-class public schools and expanding Medicaid so that more people can get health care and so that we also lower property tax bills, when they see the contrast of Greg Abbott's divisiveness and his culture wars and these stunts that he's pulling on the border with our focus on real solutions that bring people together, they want to be part of this. And Brian, I'm not waiting for them to come to us. I'm going to where they are. So going to communities like Amarillo or San Angelo or Lubbock or Childress or Olney, or these communities that for far too long, frankly, have been written off by Democrats as too tough to win in. So we're not going to even compete. These are the places that we're showing up. And the best thing that I hear at these things is someone coming up to me afterwards saying, look, I didn't even want to come to this thing. My girlfriend dragged me out, but I heard what you had to say, Beto, and I really like the message, and I want to get behind you. We were in a part of the Panhandle that's very rural and very red, and at a small town hall meeting, there were 4 or 5 guys wearing "Make America Great Again" hats, and they politely listened. They engaged in the town hall. We had conversations on issues that we didn't agree on, but we did so respectfully and civilly. And at the end of it, one of those guys in a MAGA hat came over and he shook my hand. He said, "Hey, I'd love to take a picture with you." And after we took the picture, he said, "Where do I sign up to volunteer?" So if we will keep the door open to everyone who wants to be a part of this, if we refuse to judge anybody or write anybody off, there is no limit to what we can do in this state, including winning this incredibly important election in November.
Well, we'll leave it there. Beto, you're putting in the work like no one else is. So thanks, and best of luck in the campaign.
Thank you, Brian. See you soon.